Imagine a mass that begins without a word. Everyone is silent, candles are lit, sacred words echo. But as you sit there, you feel an unsettling feeling within you that you can't explain. Your heart beats a little faster, the air around you grows heavier, and you feel as if there's an invisible veil between the prayers. At that moment, the thought that runs through your mind is simple. Is this just what I'm sensing, or is something actually happening? This is precisely the moment Padre Pio warned about. He said that these subtle, silent signs that emerge during Mass are never coincidental. According to him, even in sacred spaces, if one isn't careful, spiritual imbalances can occur. Sometimes a divine warning, sometimes an invisible energy trying to attract attention, can be behind this feeling. Padre Pio's students used to tell the story. While praying with him, the heavy atmosphere felt in the atmosphere would suddenly dissipate, giving way to a profound peace. This shift indicated that Pio had intuitively realized something and changed the direction of his prayer. He prayed not just with words, but with feeling. He used to say, "Even God's silence carries a message," and this saying reminds us that the inexplicable unease you feel during Mass can actually be a message of some kind. Most people suppress their inner warnings at such moments, saying, "It's my imagination." But according to Padre Pio's teachings, a believer should listen to their intuition, because sometimes God's warning comes not through words, but through feelings. If you've ever questioned the meaning of the emotions that pass through you during a Mass, you're not alone. Many believers throughout the centuries have shared this experience, being in a sacred space and feeling an inner unease. This isn't a sign of weakness of faith. It's a sign of spiritual awareness, because the divine sometimes comes not through peace, but through awareness first. Padre Pio used to say that what we should pay most attention to during Mass is not just the words, but the spirit of the setting. If the air feels heavy, if the candles suddenly flicker, if you feel an unexplained anxiety within you, these are often overlooked signs. This could indicate that the pure energy of prayer is encountering resistance. He always admonished his students, a prayer should not just rise from your tongue, but from within your heart. If your heart is constricted, prayer is hindered there. This sentence illustrates how the uneasiness experienced during Mass can actually be a warning, an invitation, an opportunity for purification. Sometimes this uneasiness is felt before an inner cleansing begins. Like the calm before a storm, a heaviness comes first, then peace emerges. And here's a crucial point. If you suppress this feeling, you could miss the divine message. One of the most striking events from Padre Pio's life was the profound uneasiness he experienced during Mass. One day, while praying, his face suddenly paled, his heart felt heavy, and the place fell silent. Everyone was worried, but Pio closed his eyes and continued to pray silently. A few minutes later, an indescribable peace pervaded the atmosphere, as if a veil had been lifted. In that moment, those present sensed that something evil had been exorcised. Pio later simply said, "At that moment, I felt God was warning us. I continued to pray, because I should have met the warning with faith, not fear." This is a principle that frequently appears in his teachings. Unrest is not a punishment, but a call. If you too feel an inner tremor during a Mass, perhaps it's an invitation, a call to deeper prayer, a stronger surrender. Pay attention, for in such moments God's hand silently touches, and those who recognize that touch experience a true transformation in their lives. Now stop and think. When was the last time you felt an inner unrest during a Mass? Perhaps that moment wasn't a warning, but a call to awaken. If you've experienced this feeling before, leave a comment saying, "I felt it." For there are many souls in this community who have noticed the same sign. Sharing this experience brings awareness not only to you, but to others. As Padre Pio said, "The eye that sees the unseen is illuminated by faith." And perhaps your restlessness is your soul's first response to turning toward the light. That quiet whisper heard during Mass is sometimes God's way of saying, "I am here." We simply need to learn to listen to the silence to hear it. Those around Padre Pio said that his authority stemmed not only from his position in the Church, but also from a spiritual depth. In his presence, people felt both the peace of God and the nakedness of their own consciences. For Pio was not merely a priest, but a witness who had approached God's secrets. His wisdom was nourished not by books, but by his suffering, his prayers, and his silent conversations with God. He knew that even within a person's darkest fears, there was a light, but to reach that light, one had first to kneel to surrender inner pride. Therefore, people came to Pio not only for miracles, but for guidance. His words, though often beginning as a warning, ultimately became a comfort. One time, a young soldier came to Padre Pio, filled with guilt. When he entered the confessional, his knees weakened and his heart pounded in his chest. He had returned from war. His hands were bloody and his conscience would not be silenced. Pio listened to him in silence for a long time. Then, bowing his head, he said, "My son, sometimes a person chooses to live in the hell of his own conscience, instead of seeking refuge in God's justice. But know that God sees your heart even before hearing your repentance." The soldier understood in that moment. Pio's authority was based not on fear, but on compassion. His firmness was a way of preserving God's love. Padre Pio's wisdom lay in his ability to express profound truths with simple words. He said that there was an echo of God within every person, but to hear that echo, one had to first distance oneself from the noise of the world. Padre Pio's authority stemmed from his presence, not his words. Many said that even his gaze could read their inner selves. Some people who entered his presence would weep without uttering a single word. For he sensed the hidden conflict, the pride, the regret within. This insight came not from ordinary wisdom, but from a deep spiritual connection. His connection with God was so strong that it was said that he was sometimes seen in different places simultaneously during his prayers. These events were called bilocations. It was said that he was praying in a monastery, while simultaneously being seen in another country, leading a soldier. Such stories made him not just a priest, but a living miracle worker. But Pio himself paid no attention to these extraordinary events. For him, miracles were not meant to strengthen faith, but to teach humility. One day, a woman came crawling on her knees and begged, "Heal me, Padre." He simply replied, "I don't heal, I only pray. It happens if God wills." Beneath this answer lay a profound wisdom. Even as God's intermediary, man could never replace God. Pio was always aware of his limitations. His authority stemmed from this awareness. His confident presence often inspired awe in people. But beneath that fear lay a trembling surrender of the soul. People knew they couldn't hide their own darkness in his presence. He longed to see God's light in their hearts, not on their faces. Therefore, he considered the tears of the penitent sacred and the silence of the arrogant a warning. Pride, he would say, is the devil's original sin. But humility is the key that unlocks the gates of heaven. Padre Pio's wisdom reminded us of something the modern world quickly forgets. Spiritual authority is gained through submission, not status. He didn't run from his own suffering. He transformed it into a prayer. Every wound was like a prayer scar. Every silence was a call. He gave people confidence because he had learned to trust God. His stance was not a wall but a bridge, and this bridge was the thinnest line between the sinner and the forgiving God. Pio often said, "To trust God is to believe in him even when you don't understand him." This statement was the source of both his authority and his peace, for he knew that trust is stronger than fear in man's relationship with God. He established authority through faith, not fear. Therefore, there was a balance in his teachings, firmness and tenderness, judgment and mercy. This balance could only arise from a heart completely surrendered to God. Padre Pio's wisdom resonates even today, for he taught people to seek meaning rather than miracles. He showed that assurance lies not in outward signs, but in inner surrender. Perhaps that is why even today his words are repeated like a prayer. Do not fear. God will never abandon you. And perhaps this is the greatest authority of all, the silent assurance of a soul whose heart has surrendered to God. Padre Pio believed that the greatest danger in the spiritual life was not what was obviously bad, but what was silently ignored. According to him, the decline of the soul did not occur suddenly. It occurred slowly, almost imperceptibly. First, a person would ignore minor unrests, then inattention during prayer, then the whispers of conscience. These small oversights would gradually extinguish the light within the soul. Pio often said, "Darkness does not come suddenly. It descends silently when we lose sight of the light." And he believed that many of God's warnings to humanity were hidden in these quiet moments. Many people dismiss the small signs that appear in their lives as meaningless. They call them coincidences, or even dismiss them by saying, "I had a feeling, but I didn't listen." According to Padre Pio, these feelings were intuitions born of the soul's connection with God. If a person turned their back on these intuitions, they would gradually fall into spiritual blindness. Padre Pio described this blindness as hidden sin, because in that case, a person would no longer be guided by God, but by their own logic. Logic, when the voice of the soul is silenced, becomes a kind of armor, but that armor also disconnects them from divine guidance. During Padre Pio's years of ministry, many would come to him and ask, "Why doesn't God hear my prayers?" Pio would then calmly reply, "God answers you, but you want to hear something else." This statement summarized the greatest illusion in people's spiritual journey. God's speech is silent, but human desires are very loud. Therefore, we often ignore the signs. Yet every discomfort, every restlessness, even every rejection can be a manipulation. At this point, Pio discussed the concept of spiritual attention. This attention is an awareness directed not at the external world, but at the vibrations of the inner world. If a person loses this awareness, they would perceive even the most important warnings in their life as ordinary. One day a woman came to Pio and told him that she kept having the same dream. In her dream, she was walking down a dark corridor, finally waking up without reaching a light. The woman thought the dream was simply stress-induced, but Padre Pio bowed his head and said, "The dream is telling you something. God sometimes speaks to us in dreams because our hearts are very busy during the day. This dream shows you where you've stopped praying." The woman began to cry at that moment, for she had indeed forgotten to pray for a long time. This incident demonstrated how Padre Pio read signs. He knew the language of the unseen. But the real problem was that people no longer knew this language. The modern world, in its attempt to rationalize the reasons for everything, had silenced the symbolic language of the soul. This problem was evident even in Padre Pio's lifetime. People wanted to see God's miracles, but they didn't want to hear God's warnings. Yet, according to Pio, the path to miracles often began with taking the warnings seriously. A nun wrote to Padre Pio asking, "Sometimes I have a bad feeling inside me, but I don't know what it means. Maybe I'm just afraid?" Pio replied, "Fear is often a tool God uses to slow you down. Don't suppress it too quickly. Listen, because sometimes even fear contains a warning." This quote summarizes Pio's perspective on spiritual awareness. Every emotion, every discomfort, if listened to carefully, is a teacher. But if one suppresses it, that teacher will one day return as pain. Ignored signs have not only spiritual, but also physical consequences. Pio often said that spiritual unrest lies behind people's illnesses. When the soul cries silently, the body speaks, he said. If a person doesn't hear God's inner calls, at some point life itself will warn them. Accidents, losses, breakages, all are echoes of neglected parts of the soul. Therefore, Pio advised reading every event in prayer, for prayer was the only way to understand the language of unseen signs. Padre Pio's quiet yet profound teaching remains true even today. God always speaks but rarely shouts. Therefore, the most dangerous moment is not when God is silent, but when we stop hearing. Every sign ignored heralds the next test. And as Pio said, God warns because he loves. Without warning, there is no direction. Only when one grasps this truth can one find peace, for peace lies not in what is ignored, but in what is recognized and accepted. Padre Pio said that the path to relieving the soul's restlessness lay not in miracles, but in conscious surrender. According to him, anyone who wanted to hear God's voice must first silence the noise within themselves, for God speaks in silence, and finding that silence is the most difficult test for modern man. Therefore, Pio taught 3 fundamental steps to regaining spiritual awareness: stopping, listening, and surrendering. These 3 steps open the door to a seemingly simple yet profound spiritual transformation. For before a person can realign with God, they must recognize their own inner turmoil. Each step lifts a veil from the soul, relieves a burden, and ultimately opens the heart to divine guidance. The first step, stopping. Padre Pio knew very well why most people were restless, because they never stopped. They were either mired in the regrets of the past or drowning in the anxieties of the future. God is only found in the present, Pio would say. But you are either preoccupied with yesterday or tomorrow, so the first step was to stop. To stop before praying, to stop before thinking, even to stop before speaking. Because stopping was not just a physical act, it was an inner awareness. When that moment came, a person's mind began to catch up with their soul. Pio said that stopping was not a surrender but an awakening, because only when one stops does one realize how tired their own soul is. Without this awareness, no prayer, no repentance could reach the heart. One of Pio's students recounts, "One day I told him that I couldn't feel God when I prayed. He simply said, 'Have you tried stopping?' I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but then I realized my prayers weren't to find God, but to quell my own fears." This was at the heart of Padre Pio's teaching. To stop was to stop running, because most of the time, people were running not from God but from their own truth. Yet God was there even in our most naked state. And that awareness was the first healing step. The second step, listen. Padre Pio used to say, "Those who say God doesn't speak are those who don't know how to listen." Listening was an act performed not only with the ear, but also with the heart. He prayed for hours every day, but also waited in silence. For prayer was speaking, but listening was understanding. He said that most of God's answers came not with words, but with events. Sometimes a rejection, sometimes an illness, sometimes a seemingly chance encounter. Pio saw none of these events as coincidences. Each one was an answer, but only those who knew how to listen could hear that answer. Listening required patience. One had to suppress one's own desires and trust God's timing. God's silence is not rejection, Pio said. That silence is the time He prepares you. This understanding brought peace to many souls. People often expected an immediate answer from God and doubted when they couldn't wait. According to Padre Pio, God sometimes gave His most profound teaching through silence. Listening also required hearing the conscience. Pio believed that there was a delicate connection between a person's inner voice and the voice of God. If the heart was pure, the conscience spoke like the echo of God. But when the heart was filled with pride, that voice would be drowned. This was the essence of surrender, not loss but letting go. And this letting go was the rebirth of the soul. Pio said that surrender was the most powerful prayer, because it was written not in words, but in the state of the heart. Having the belief that be and it is would keep one calm in any storm. Therefore, one of Pio's most well-known sayings is, "Do not be afraid. Pray, hope, and do not worry." Worry shows that you do not trust God. This phrase is like the spiritual summary of the 3 steps: stop, listen, and surrender. For one who practices these 3 steps, no longer lives by fear but by faith. This path, taught by Padre Pio, continues to serve as a compass for many souls lost in the modern world. While people still search for external miracles, Pio's voice echoes across time. The miracle is not in seeing God, but in trusting Him. These 3 steps, to stop, to listen, to surrender, are not just a spiritual prescription, but a teaching on balance that applies to every aspect of life. For these steps move one from chaos to peace, from fear to confidence, and ultimately, a heart attuned to God's light no longer fears any storm, for it knows that the voice heard in silence is the voice of that which is beyond all things. Padre Pio's teachings weren't just words. They became real stories of transformation in the lives of countless people who knew him, prayed with him, and even felt his influence from afar. One such story is the testimony of a woman struggling with spiritual unrest. Her name was Maria, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life yet carrying a deep turmoil in her heart. She went to Mass every Sunday, prayed and went to confession, yet the weight within her never lifted. It was as if an invisible hand was squeezing her heart, whispering doubts into her mind during each prayer. "Does God really hear me?" she asked herself. This silent questioning gradually turned into despair, so much so that even during Mass, instead of peace, she felt guilt. One day, under the dim lights of the church, the priest read one of Padre Pio's prayers. At that moment, Maria heard Pio's name for the first time, and a voice within her told her, "Go listen to him." It wasn't just curiosity, it was a deep calling. Sometime later, Maria went to San Giovanni Rotondo, a small village in Italy. Padre Pio was still alive at the time. Thousands of people traveled for miles to see him. Maria waited in the crowd, her heart pounding. She didn't even know what to say. When her turn came, she stood before Padre Pio. When she raised her eyes, she saw the famous perforated hands, the stigmata. Pio looked at her without a word, then smiled silently. Just as Maria was about to speak, Padre Pio gently raised his hand and said, "There is a fog around your heart. But don't be afraid. That fog is for God to find you again." These words shook Maria deeply. She began to cry, for no one had ever described the darkness within her so accurately. Padre Pio took her hand and continued, "Sometimes God doesn't leave you in the darkness. He simply rests your eyes to prepare you for the light. This sentence was a turning point in Maria's life. From that moment on, she began to pray, guided by Pio. In the early days, she was still restless, sometimes even short of breath while praying. But she began to practice the 3 steps Pio had prescribed: stop, listen, surrender. Every morning before going to church, she would sit in silence for a while, wishing for nothing but listening to her heart. As the days passed, the noise in her mind diminished. Then she realized that her prayers were no longer born of fear, but of love. Years later, during a Mass, Maria experienced one of those old moments of uneasiness. Her heart clenched, as if a shadow from the past had returned. But this time she wasn't afraid. She remembered Padre Pio's words, "When darkness comes, just be silent." Previously afraid of everything, she now smiled as she prayed, even in the most difficult moments. "I'm no longer afraid that God doesn't hear me," she said, "because even in the silence I feel He is with me." These words were a vivid reflection of Padre Pio's teachings. He lived not to perform miracles, but to make people realize the light already within them. Years later, Maria's daughter told this story. Like her mother, she experienced a spiritual transformation. "I remember my mother carrying that peace even in her last days," she said. "Before her death, she said to me, 'Don't be afraid. In the silence you will hear His voice.' That sentence became a refuge for me in my storms. This testimony became a divine echo passed down from generation to generation. For once, someone who hears God's silence is never the same again." Thousands of such stories were heard throughout Padre Pio's life. Some were healed of illness, others found lost faith, and still others simply felt a stone lifted from their hearts. But they all said the same thing. Meeting with Him, even for a moment, leaves an echo in the depths of the soul, and this echo is felt even today. For what Pio taught was not a ritual, but a path of awareness. Maria's story is not merely an individual miracle. It mirrors the inner struggle of every faithful heart. We all dwell in the dark at times, feeling like our prayers go unanswered. But perhaps the answer is already within us. We simply forget to listen to the silence. Padre Pio's guidance teaches us to hear that voice again. And if you find yourself in a similar state of unrest today, don't consider this story a coincidence. Perhaps God is speaking to you right now with that quiet voice Maria heard years ago. If you've experienced a moment like this in your life, perhaps during a brief prayer, perhaps in a moment of serenity, if you felt an inner transformation, write "I felt it too" in the comments. Because this journey isn't just one person's. It's the journey of all of us. As Padre Pio said, when souls touch, God is there. And perhaps as you read this story, you too have felt that touch now. According to Padre Pio's teachings, finding peace for the soul is possible not only in the liturgy, but by responding to God's silent call at every moment of the day. The energy received during the liturgy should not disappear after leaving that space. On the contrary, it should permeate the walls of our homes, our breath, our thoughts, and our relationships. Many people feel a deep peace in sacred spaces, but lose that silence upon returning home, because peace lives not only in the stones of the church, but in one's intention. This is what Padre Pio was really saying when he said, "The day is in God's hands. Simply open your heart to Him." Spiritual protection is not just a prayer or ritual, it is a form of mindfulness. Small actions performed every day become an invisible shield. Waking up in the morning, touching your chest and saying, "I am safe," is the simplest way to remember God's presence for the rest of the day. This phrase reshapes the mind. Because when the mind accustoms itself to trust, not fear, spiritual energy rises, and negative influences naturally recede. Padre Pio's students used to tell us about the 3 simple steps he took every morning before starting his day: gratitude, forgiveness, and surrender. This triad is the armor of the soul. Every morning when you wake up, take a moment to say, "Today I will live with God's guidance." Then give thanks for 3 things. These can be simple things: a breath, a friendship, a moment of silence. Gratitude opens the heart. Then if someone has hurt you, let them go in your mind. Forgiveness clears the energy. In the final step, surrender, internally saying, "I relinquish control to you." Surrender is letting God do His work. Carry this awareness throughout the day. If you feel restlessness, whisper a short prayer as Padre Pio suggested, "My soul belongs to you." This simple phrase instantly dissolves dark energies. For the darkness retreats when it hears the name of the light. In the evening, before going to bed, light a candle. As the candle's flame burns, visualize everything you experience that day. Padre Pio used to say, recite your soul to God every night. Express your fears, your joys, your doubts silently, for God hears intentions more than words. Then place your hands on your heart and whisper these 3 words. I forgive, I love, I trust. These 3 words reopen the doors of your soul. If you see a sign throughout the day, for example, an unlit candle, a flickering cross, or a sudden change in the weather, note it. These signs are messages sent to you, but approach with awareness, not fear. Because Padre Pio said, God does not create fear, he creates awareness. Remember, signs are not meant to punish, but to guide you. Read each sign with the eyes of your heart. Let your soul, not your mind, interpret it. If you practice this little ritual every night, you will notice a shift in the energy in your home within a few days. The air will feel lighter, your dreams will become clearer, and your inner dialogue will take on a more peaceful tone. Because a home is an extension of a praying heart. If there is light in your heart, that light will filter through the walls. Padre Pio's students recount, when you entered his cell, you felt a warmth, as if an invisible wave of peace was there. That peace was built through daily surrender. Your home can be such a place too. Wake up every morning with gratitude. Sleep every night with surrender. Let your soul become accustomed to peace. And if you want to feel that you are not alone on this journey, leave just one word in the comments. I am ready. Because this word is the beginning of spiritual intention. A ready soul calls upon the light. When the intentions of each of us in this community unite, an invisible chain of prayer is formed. This is true protection. If you found meaning in this video today, if Padre Pio's wisdom touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, because here every video is a prayer, every sentence a light, every word a seed of awareness. Remember, peace does not come from the outside. It is remembered from within. And tonight, let that remembrance begin with you.